To some, living in the country is the dream. To others, they think ghosts live in the trees. Shelby spent her first 15 summers living in the back country. But everything changed the year she turned 16. Welcome to Spooky Boo's Story Hour, where I read you stories written just for you. But it's your choice if they're real or if they're fake. So welcome to the house on 87th.
I'm packed and ready to go. Shelby held up the denim backpack in her arms. Her mother was perched at the dining room table, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. Great. Be safe. She waved her daughter off, not even bothering to turn around and look at her. Shelby understood that her mother was busy with work, but when wasn't she? Had she turned around, she would have seen the colorful beaded bracelet Shelby made running down her wrist. Her mom wasn't one to notice much. It stung as another reminder that this wasn't any different. As soon as the calendar flipped to June, school was out, and the summer sun told Shelby that her favorite time of year was upon her. Each summer was spent at her grandparents' house, only a short train ride away. Their home was on a large plot of land where the crickets sang loud and the wind echoed through the wooden chimes. It was a nice contrast to the commotion of city life that Shelby grew accustomed to. No goodbye hug. No well wishes. Shelby swore she could hear her mother's sigh of relief as the door latched behind her. It was no surprise, considering she never called while Shelby was gone. She longed for the day she'd return home to her mother and that she would ask her to share all of the fun things she did, what she learned, what her favorite part of the stay was. Yet, as time went on, those questions never came, and Shelby's hope for them fizzled away. The exchange each summer was like a silent transaction between Shelby's mother and grandparents. She served as the only string left between them, both edges frayed. When she was younger, her mother would at least walk her to the train station to send her off. Still, not in the emotional way she craved. Most girls at 16 years old would have appreciated the independence, even slightly relieved that their mother wasn't babysitting them in public. But Shelby should have enjoyed the touch of overbalance from her mother, leaving her feeling missed and loved. As the train car rattled down the track, Shelby didn't have her usual buzz of excitement. This summer would be different than any other she'd spent with her grandparents. There wouldn't be long hours sitting in her grandfather's workshop, building and painting fishing lures together. There wouldn't be a jar of fireflies illuminating her bedside table, no glass Coke bottles, and no stray bowls of Cracker Jacks. Because Shelby's grandfather was dead after never returning home from a walk around the property. Shelby stared out the window of the train. A group of tall black birds gathered next to the tracks, looking prehistoric in their stature. The land was dry and brittle, suffering from the lack of rainfall. Her eyes squinted as the train passed by. Beneath the birds was a carcass of a larger animal. Decaying flesh clung to its bones as she watched as they used their curved beaks to rip and tear at the barrel-like structure of the animal's ribcage, tearing off layers, piece by piece. Shivers tore through her. The birds feasting on the dead animal sent her mind into a spiral of thoughts she tried to push away. The image popped into her mind before she could stop it. Her grandfather's body, alone in the woods behind his house, subjected to the elements. How many species had feasted on him in that week's time? Dead and alone. Shelby wasn't supposed to know that detail, but her mom left the phone on speaker when the coroner called. She nervously twisted at the beads on her wrist as her mind shifted to her grandmother. With her grandfather serving as a staple for her visits, she couldn't imagine what it would be like with only her around, grieving nothingness. Shelby even tried to call the line, but it was always busy. Her mother said she probably pulled it off the hook, intentionally bypassing any incoming calls. That showed Shelby that this visit was an even more important one. Usually, her grandfather would pick her up from the train station. They'd sit side by side on the bench of his pickup truck, and he'd ask her about school. He'd point out the new businesses that popped up and share his 2 cents on the fluctuating economy of the small town. Too much change, he was griping. Not enough change, he was griping. Regardless of how he felt about it, if she pointed out something she wanted to see or do, Her grandfather always made sure they squeezed it into her visit. This visit was marked with more loneliness as Shelby exchanged her seat on the train for a seat on the bus. There was no pickup truck waiting for her. The bus took her down the narrow 2-lane towards her grandparents' home. Her grandfather warned her about the high-speed limit on the road, and on rare occasions they drove it at night. It was a blanket of darkness, with no streetlights in sight. One of the few bus stops on the road happened to be close to their home, and Shelby hurried down the steps of the bus into the grass, then went up along the driveway. Wow, she sighed. The grass was overgrown and full of weeds and dandelions. Her grandfather would have never let the grass grow so high. Shelby's vision blurred over with tears. While it was only grass, it was further proof that he was gone. The front door was locked when she jingled the handle. This was new to her, not having her grandfather bring her to the house, beaming as he held her backpack for her. However, the summer before, he had given her a small silver key with a white bumble of paint to distinguish it from the rest. "Just in case," he said, as he dropped the key into her palm. "If you ever need to get into the house, don't tell your grandmother." With a twist of the key, the lock freed open, and Shelby pushed through the doorway. All of the blinds were pulled close, and the scent of cigarette smoke hit her like a wall. It hardly looked like the home she had visited each year. The structure was the same, but it was dull and lifeless. A bedroom door down the hallway inched open, and through the crack, smoke flowed and eyes peeked out at her. "Grandma?" she called out. "It's Shelby." She stayed quiet, only widening the door to bring the cigarette to her lips and take a puff. Her body remained concealed behind it. Shelby stepped through the home, wishing it was all a nightmare and that things could go back to how they used to be. "Shelby?" her grandmother said, her voice croaky and pained. Shelby had never heard her so raspy. She let her into the bedroom, and her grandmother promptly sealed the door shut. The harsh smell invaded her nostrils, burning all the way back to her throat, but Shelby stifled a brewing cough. "I didn't know you were coming." "It's the 2nd week of June. I always come in the 2nd week of June, Grandma." Shelby smiled at her, hoping to ignite a spark of life in the woman in front of her. Silence passed over them. Shelby heard the drawing in of her grandmother's lungs, the peeling sound of her dry lips as she pulled the cigarette away to exhaust a cloud of smoke. "I'm sorry about," she started to say, grasping to fill the awkward silence. "That easel is folded up in the workshop. Go work on something new and make him proud." Her words tumbled out quickly, cutting off Shelby. "Painting? Right now?" she thought. She stood next to the bed and looked around the room. The memories she had of it surely didn't involve tousled blankets and makeshift ashtrays on nearly every surface. Turns out the visit would involve Coke bottles, but not in the way she wished, instead filled with ash and cigarette butts. "I'll set it up," Shelby said softly. As soon as she was out of the bedroom, the door was sealed shut again, creaking on its hinges. Suddenly, her mother and grandmother weren't all so different from each other after all. The walk from the remodeled garage that was her grandfather's garage was morose. All of his projects sat in the space unfinished, including a batch of new lures. He'd hate that. Maybe working on a painting would be her saving grace. He always told her to never give up painting. She had far too much talent for it to go to waste. Shelby set up a stool and an easel from the workshop in a grassy area outside where most of the weeds were dead, close to the house next door. It always spooked her, but also fostered a curiosity in her for as long as she could remember. The easel stood in front of her, blank. She dipped the brush in the paint and trailed the bristles along the canvas, her eyes slipping back and forth to the house. It was her inspiration. It was quite an eyesore, with splintered wood and chipping paint and cracked stained glass window in the front where the attic was. When Shelby was little, she asked her grandfather about it. "That house there?" he said, pointing to it. "You stay away from there. It's dangerous and no good comes out of that place." Shelby could tell he was serious, as he didn't offer up a chuckle or a wink afterwards. She remembered the moment in so much detail. They were painting the fishing lures he'd shown Shelby how to build. He noticed that she had a knack for painting things and told her to run wild with the paint. Shelby took that as permission to create patterns on the lures. They laughed at the colors and patterns, but the lines were clean, and she was fast, and that was the start of her love for painting. His warning stuck with her. She always looked at the house as a young child, wondering if the floor would cave in if she stepped on it, like in a horror movie. But her main question was about who would let an old house sit there forever, a question her grandfather wouldn't answer. The lines of paint flowed to one another as she began the outline of the old house. It came to life. Flicking the brush, she outlined the dark exterior walls, but her attention was pulled away from the canvas. Something moved and caught her eye inside the home. Shelby wasn't going to wait around for it to happen again. Stepping into the weeds, it made her skin itch as she moved closer to the house. The movement was on the other side of the glass. It was foggy and dirty from the inside out, though still possible to see through. She froze when the object appeared again. It wasn't just something in the house. It was someone. The shadow turned into a face, smiling at her. Shelby's blood grew cold. It was a boy, who looked about the same age as her. He waved, and she slowly lifted her arm to wave back. Still confused, the house always seemed abandoned, and not a place with a boy her age. As he waved her towards the front door, Shelby followed, leaving behind the easel and supplies. His smile was warm and inviting. The broken steps creaked below her feet, whispering their warnings to her, but they were no match for the charming-looking boy drawing Shelby into the house. As he stood in the doorframe, Shelby noticed something about his clothing was different. He dressed like he was from a few decades before her. "Hi," she said. The musky scent of the crumbling home was overpowering. He couldn't actually live there, could he? "Hey." Something about his voice doubled down on the warmth. It was against her better judgment to go deeper into the home, but Shelby ignored the warning signs. "How long have you been here? I come here every year and I've never seen..." The boy was chuckling. Shelby laughed too, mirroring his disposition, even though nothing was funny. "I've been here a while," he finally said. "I'm Ben." Their hands tangled together in an awkward shake. "Shelby." Her eyes ran laps around the house. A tall pillar stood in the middle of the living room that was cracked, wrapped in cobwebs and black dust. The floors were tarnished, as were the dirty windows. It was neglected as inside as it was outside. "Do you paint outside a lot?" Shelby cleared her throat. "Sometimes when I'm here every summer, usually. How come I've never seen you before?" Ben shrugged. "Bad timing, I guess." Shelby thought of her grandfather. She heard her mother say he was found on the west side of the property near the abandoned house. Did Ben see him laying there dead for a week? He began to walk through the home, near the pillar, which gave Shelby an eerie feeling. The roof could cave in with one big gust of wind. She followed him mindlessly. "I've always wanted a friend way out here in the middle of nowhere," he said. Shelby was trying to reason through the possibility of never seeing him on the property. Her entire summers were spent next door, and surely she would have been excited to see another kid around. It would have led her to pestering her grandfather for permission to play through no such memory. Only tight-lipped forbiddance of even discussing the house. "My grandparents live next door. Do you know them?" she asked. Ben stroked his chin, patchy with facial hair. I believe we've seen each other a few times." Shelby couldn't help her stare from drifting around the room. On the end table were stacks of old books, candles, and dishes. Everything was covered with the same black dust. As the bones of the house creaked, Shelby's instincts took over. She realized that she was doing, and deliberately, going against what her grandfather had said all those years ago. "My grandmother's probably looking for me." She backed to the door. Ben's friendly expression stayed the same. "Should we hang out again tomorrow?" Shelby slipped through the front door as easily as before, running through the tall grass and weeds that now bled over between the properties. She felt herself smiling. Ben was kind and even a little charming. He was mysterious in a way that intrigued her. She returned to her grandparents' house with her easel and paints in hand. That house scared her, but Ben didn't. This would be the summer that changed her for good. Each night, Shelby sat in the small bedroom at her grandparents' house, tossing and turning. She looked out the window that faced the house next door, hoping to see a light on, Or Ben walking around outside. Anything to confirm he was real. Not something stitched together to mend her grief and loneliness. Shelby couldn't trust that she'd really talked to somebody in that old house. She went over a few more times, all short visits, almost like the same day on repeat. Each time it was darker and more stagnant than the last visit, but her eyes would land on the same old stuff that made it seem like the house was a time capsule. Ben evaded any questions about himself and was strategic on how he'd flip the questions back onto her. Eventually, he asked her to bring her easel. He said he wanted her to teach him how to paint. As bizarre as it was, Shelby was hooked. A new routine had formed in lieu of the one that she had lost with her grandfather. Shelby raked her fingers along the books stacked on the end table. She always stared at them and finally had the nerve to touch them. A thick layer of black dust and grime nested under her fingernails. "Why do you have these old books?" Ben did the uneven little shrug Shelby became accustomed to noticing. "You can learn a lot from old books." "This house seems stopped in time. I still find it hard to believe you've been here all along." She narrowed her eyes at him. But Ben always had answers, ones that only served as a placeholder and gave her more questions. "Maybe I'm an old soul." Shelby thumbed through the books, tried to turn on a small salt lamp without success, and even opened a cabinet on the wall. Nothing out of the ordinary, but all old and ruined by dirty air and the passing of time. "I need to wash my hands," she said. Ben gestured to the narrow hallway through the heart of the home. Shelby pushed away her smile. He had some kind of southern charm that you only hear about in movies or books. Maybe Ben was right. He was just an old soul in a young body, a rarity. The tiny bathroom was the second door on the left. Shelby flipped the light switch, yet nothing happened. Right away, she noticed the mirror was fogged over with steam, though there wasn't a shower in the tiny space. Shelby rubbed the back of her arm along the glass and nothing changed, only adding more filth to her skin. How could anyone live in such a dirty place without power? A crank of the rusty faucet knobs did very little for Shelby's hands. A thick sludge trickled out, staining the porcelain bowl. She shivered. No water? As a last resort, she rubbed her hands on her jeans and would worry about the stains later. Temptation pulled at her again. Instead of returning to Ben, she poked her head through the closest bedroom. The floor was covered in old newspaper clippings. A wooden chair was shoved into the corner. She stepped in. Seeing a calendar on the wall, the large X's marked throughout the days, stopping on October 8th, 1992. Keeping a 20-year-old calendar hung up didn't seem right to Shelby. Instead of calling her snooping off, she tiptoed into another small bedroom across the hall. A striped mattress lay on the ground. It was ripped open, the innards exposed, springs and stuffing thrown across the floor, plucked out by something ravenous and determined. Flashes of the carcass next to the train filled her mind, when the gruesome image of her grandfather in the woods lay in the same fate. The scavengers. Was there also a scavenger in this house? Nausea coursed through her stomach, rising in her throat and sending a feverish sweat throughout her. She backed out of the room, regretting her decision to snoop. She jumped when she saw a woman standing in the hallway. Her face was covered in blood and cuts. Her jaw was unhinged, locked into the position of a scream. She wailed out a cry. "No, no," was all Shelby could mutter out, as the woman turned to run down the hallway and out of the house. Shelby's hands trembled as she covered her mouth to stop herself from screaming. She ran towards the living room, towards Ben. The woman was nowhere to be found. "That lady! Who was she?" Ben chuckled, looking around the space. "What are you talking about?" "The woman with the blood and the cuts and the crying." Her breath was shaky and uneven. "I don't know what you're talking about." A lingering laughter was stuck behind Ben's words. He didn't believe her. He missed the sight of the woman. Or maybe he only wanted her to think so. "Was that your mom?" "You've still never told me about who else lives here." Her words came out fast and shoved together. "You should sit down." Ben tried to guide her to the dirty love seat with the claw feet on the bottom. "Ben, I know you saw that." You said your grandpa died recently. Have you seen a lot of that stuff, like related to dead people? Shelby pointed towards the hallway with a shaky finger. That was real. You won't convince me otherwise. A crack of thunder halted any reply from Ben. Shelby jumped at the sound. I know you haven't forgotten about the summer thunderstorms here, he smiled, only frustrating Shelby even further. They're a little late this year. Deflated, she sat on the love seat like you wanted her to. The rain flooded off the ceiling and onto the dirt next to the house. Shelby stared at her easel in the center of the living room, replaying the sight of the hurt woman. Who was she? It wouldn't be the first time she encountered a terrifying person inside that house. On separate occasions, Shelby also saw a girl and a boy not much younger than herself. Blood oozed out of their eyes and down their cheeks, and they ran through the home screaming, but disappeared into nowhere. Ghosts in the hallways. Yet, Ben had the same response each time, stating that he didn't know what she was talking about. Is it something she made up in her head? Caused by leftover grief? Shelby spent hours trying to understand what she saw. In the back of her mind, her theory is that it was the family that had lived there before Ben, or that her mind was indeed playing tricks on her. How could she be sure that they weren't vivid hallucinations, little creatures put together by the horrors of her mind? Shelby found herself desperate for an answer. Ben wouldn't fess up much about himself, and she'd thrown out all the possibilities. A squatter, a ghost, or maybe just a charismatic boy with an old soul. Either way, she needed some kind of proof. In the bedroom she slept in, Shelby pried open her laptop and searched the address of the house next door. Clicking on an appraisal documentation, it was last rented out in 1990, and no later. That meant Shelby's mother likely knew who lived there when she was young. She may know what event occurred that scorned Shelby's grandfather into forbidding her curiosity about the property. Digging deeper, she found a digitized article from 1992. Local family found dead after fire. Foul play suspected. Shelby couldn't believe what she was reading and double-checked the address on the report. 423 State Road, number 87. That was it. The details of the article outlined the death of a single mother who worked as a waitress at the diner at the south end of State Road 87. Jenny McMahon and her children were found dead in their front yard of their home, and then it was set on fire deliberately. Authorities had reasons to believe it was her teenage son, Benjamin. Shelby blinked a few times while she stared at the name. Benjamin McMahon. That was Ben. She also recognized the last name. Maybe. She continued taking in the details even though it pained her to do so. The webpage had comments that claimed Ben set the house on fire in a fit of rage after his girlfriend Melissa proposed a breakup, stating that there was a new guy in the picture. Ben lost control and attacked his family with a knife. He sealed the deal when he set the house up in flames. Melissa was her mother's name. Everything fell together in Shelby's mind. There was an old photo album full of her mother's photos growing up. One on the front of a yellow-hued Polaroid picture of her mom and her boyfriend. In cursive handwriting it said, Melissa and Benjamin McMahon, prom, 1991. Shelby remembered because the cursive writing blended all the M's and N's. The loops ran together, and Shelby asked her mother what it said. She told Shelby the name and then shut down and barked at her daughter to stop digging up the past. Her mother was never one to speak about her life growing up. The version of Ben she knew was the same as the one who set his house up in flames. But if it was her mother's teenage boyfriend, how was he still so young? His family died in that house because of him, yet he denied their existence. Shelby couldn't help but wonder if she was losing touch with reality. Nothing about this summer stay was the same, and she needed out. Right on time, Ben said as he pulled the door open to see Shelby. They'd spent a few evenings together now, and their newest routine was her coming over around dusk on the cusp of nightfall. Her back stiffened. I'm just grabbing my easel and paints. I am leaving my grandparents' house. His face pinched together. His anger worried Shelby. Ben couldn't know the truth of why she was leaving or why she was so scared and confused of him. The open house was behind him, and all had a new horrible meaning for her. All that dust and dirt was soot from the blaze, remnants of his old life. After widening the door, Shelby beelined to the living room, but she slowed when she saw what was in the house. So many lit candles, more than she had ever seen, and a blanket in front of the fireplace. "Don't you see all of this?" he asked in a snarl. "It was for you." The candles and blanket were a romantic gesture from Ben. Shelby's jaw ticked as he snorted through the words and explained. I have to go." Ben smirked at her. "So you wasted my time. You pretended to be nice and now you're leaving? All on a special night I had planned for us." The way his voice bounced off the walls terrified Shelby. She knew what he was capable of. She felt so weak she clambered over to the easel, refusing to leave without it. But she noticed her unfinished painting was different. The painted house no longer looked abandoned and broken. It was a regular house, with bodies painted in the front yard, red paint flecked throughout. She hadn't painted that scene, had she? Shelby couldn't remember. It was all a blur. "Feels like déjà vu," he said, and barricaded himself in front of her. "What's the old saying?" His voice climbed, and Shelby's eyes slammed shut, as if it would damper the echo. "Like mother, like daughter?" It was clear. He connected the dots. His phrases showed that he knew that she had discovered he was a monster. The lit candles flickered, and Ben's shadow made him look triple the size. Shelby didn't see any way out. It all felt like a trap as she looked around the room. He had staged a romantic setting to lure her in. Had she not dug up the past, as her mom called it, she probably would have even gloated over the candles and the blanket Ben would have charmed her into submission with. She would have given him the chance she naively thought that he deserved. He wanted her in that house so he could kill again. Ben lunged at her, bumping the easel into a row of candles and igniting a fiery game of dominoes. Shelby attempted to shove him off her, but he was too strong, too ravenous, and determined, like a scavenger. With the flames spreading, Shelby rolled herself away from the heat and slipped away from Ben. Somehow, a line of fire formed to separate them. Winded, Shelby stared at him. His eyes were black with hate for her mother, and probably their entire bloodline. The fire was spreading quickly, and she knew she had to get out before she became another victim of the property and Ben. She found an open path on the other side of him and followed it to the front door, narrowly passing him. The heat trapped inside by the growing flames left her disoriented, but when she opened that front door, the night air greeted her with coolness. Before she could take another breath of clean air, she was ripped back into the house, standing back on the other side of the fire. "How?" she whispered, panicking. Ben was ready to jump towards her. He seemed to be calculating the best route to snatch her. Shelby ran to the opposite end of the house, and Ben went behind the wall of smoke and roaring flames. A back door glimmered in her line of vision. She dove for it, sliding across the blackened floor and crawling her way out into the night. She opened her eyes, only to see flames again, back in the house. Shelby was on a loop, like a mouse running on a wheel, going nowhere. Her breath was caught in her throat as she realized that the results were the same. She was destined to be trapped in this house, to die inside this house. Turning back to look at the flames head on, she spotted Ben sitting at the end of the fireplace. The blanket below turned into a sea of bright fire, growing with embers popping into the air. Against all better judgment, Shelby stepped closer to him. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring down at his lap. Moving closer let her see what he was so focused on. Laying in his lap was her, crumpled and broken with a trail of blood running from her chest. Ben was patting her head and smoothing out her hair. The blood coming from her chest was from a deep stab wound. A paint scraper pointed out from her body and looked to be embedded permanently. Shelby was powerless as she watched over her own dead body. There was nothing she could do except look at the sorry sight. He'd won. Ben killed her, and he pet her like it was his most prized possession. Flames fully engulfed the home, sending the broken beam into the ground and the roof tumbling into a pile of ash. Ben was determined to burn that house to the ground, with her in it. And he did. It was front page news the summer of 2012 when the house on State Road 87 was incinerated with flames. They say lightning never strikes the same place twice, but what do they say about fire? 16-year-old Shelby Carson took her own life in the abandoned house next door to her grandparents. The young girl was distraught after visiting her beloved grandparents' property for summer vacation, as she did every year since she was 5, only to find her grandmother deceased in the master bedroom. Authorities say she lived with the body throughout her stay, unsure how to handle the corpse and too afraid to reach out for help. The young girl was driven mad while alone in that house. The grief compounded itself as she'd lost her grandfather in the spring. Shelby let history repeat itself when she set the old abandoned house ablaze with herself inside. Fire struck twice as the old house went up in flames, scorching through the trauma of the foundation that spread across property lines. The end.